Newsfirst, Newsline.
When diplomacy ends, war begins. The world finds itself in the middle of many conflicts. We have Russia and Ukraine embroiled in a conflict. There is conflict between Taiwan and China. The West and the East are also a brewing conflict. Good evening. This is Newsline, and today's show will focus on discussing Sri Lanka's place in all of these conflicts. Like it or not, Sri Lanka is a part of the world, and we have to play the game of global politics, or geopolitics as they call it. To discuss these matters and more, we've got on our show this evening Navam Niles, a lecturer in international relations. He specifies, of course, in public international law. A very good evening, Navam, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Navam, so Sri Lanka finds itself in quite a precarious situation because this is the worst, at least, the world has been as far as peace goes or war is concerned. This is the most or the most number of conflicts in the world that the world has seen during the recent past. And Sri Lanka finds itself in the midst of all of these conflicts while facing an economic crisis in the country that is, of course, as admitted by everyone, man-made. So Sri Lanka currently are facing certain challenges at the Geneva Human Rights Council. We have been facing many challenges in the past as far as our human rights record goes. And given the current conduct of the Sri Lankan government, whether it is with regard to protests in the recent past or protecting rights of prisoners and other people in this country, Sri Lanka has not had a great run during the past as well. So we are answering for all of these at the Geneva Human Rights Council. The council sessions began a few days ago. There was much talk about it. The Foreign Minister, President's Council Ali Sabri, made a statement at the Geneva Human Rights Council. What will happen next?
Right. So the thing is, you're absolutely right. This is unprecedented times. And what's going to happen next is, as you've seen the draft resolution and also the resolutions passed by the US Congress, it seems that Sri Lanka is going to be wrapped in the knuckles, so to speak, because the consensus is that not enough progress has been made on the recommendations that were made earlier this year. And what we need to understand is that, for every country's foreign policy, including the foreign policies of the core group of countries on Sri Lanka at the UNHRC, is a reflection of the balance between values, domestic values, and foreign interest. For those countries, especially the United States, the United Kingdom, which together account for like half our exports, and are big important players in the IMF and other international institutions, their values do include, for various reasons, issues of human rights concerning Sri Lanka. Part of that is because of their participation in these institutions, and part of that is because of large, political support, domestic political support to push these ideas in the international forum. So those values have to be balanced against those countries' interests, which might involve, for example, limiting the influence of other large countries in this region, or the interests of other countries, regarding Sri Lanka. And in some cases, those countries have compromised those values for the sake of interest. You saw recently Joseph Biden going back to Saudi Arabia, even though he, claimed that he would cut off, those kind of direct relationships with the Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince. But in situations like Sri Lanka, you have to understand that for those countries, the cost of sticking by their values, so to speak, is actually quite low. Because as you mentioned earlier, Sri Lanka is in this economic crisis. So our ability to kind of move to the security of another country or to get the sponsorship of a alternative is limited. Here you have a country that has limited economic options, and as a result, we need to make a very serious decision about either changing our domestic policies. For example, the draft resolution refers to very specific policies like the PTA, or give up on particular interests like access to finance and security and cooperation at the international stage. So right now, in a situation, the international community, the core group, have leverage because the cost of their values in terms of interest is far less than it is for Sri Lanka. That's the problem we have. And this is probably going to be escalated at a bilateral level and, of course, at the UNHRC in the next few days.
So, Navam, when we speak about these international interests, do they always necessarily go against the interests of at least the people of that country, or in this case, the people of Sri Lanka, as far as even for specific example, without getting into the facts of the matter, with regard to the PTA, does it necessarily mean that these values or interests that the international community is trying to push as far as protecting human rights, reconciliation, restitution for victims, does that necessarily mean that they are against the wishes of the people or not in the interest of that local community?
That's a very, very good question, because the moment you start questioning these policies, you also have to realize that Sri Lanka is recognized as a democratic country. One way the Americans, for example, have managed to square the circle is by removing focus on the country and focusing attention on particular political leaders, particularly the previous regime. So in a sense, they are not so much criticizing the country, but trying to focus attention on a particular political faction. That's one way of looking at it. And the second thing is, like, the argument put forward, that's one argument. The second argument that you see a lot kind of percolating in these fora is that somehow or the other, these specific policies, such as the PTA, do not reflect the democratic interests of Sri Lankan people. That's something you see in the US resolutions in the House and the Senate. And even in the UNHRC, the idea that these instruments are actually being used to undermine the will of the people, so to speak. That's that particular view. And so that is how this narrative of, on the one hand, democratic government, and on the other hand, the idea that these policies are unacceptable or need to be changed or modified, is taking place in the international stage.
So Navam, speaking about policies, Sri Lanka is known to be a country of lack of policies, a country that suffers with policy inconsistency. So when speaking about international players trying to establish their policies, their values, their morals here in Sri Lanka, how far do you think it affects this attempt of international communities, the fact that Sri Lanka usually does not have stable policies? How does that really affect it?
So that's also a very good point, because at the end of the day, for a country to successfully, have a stake in human rights or democracy or whatnot, there has to be domestic support for that. We saw and we have seen in recent years countries that were, in a sense, an outside attempt to impose certain values. For example, Afghanistan and Iraq didn't really take hold because those societies weren't necessarily receptive. The domestic systems were not there. So in a country like Sri Lanka, one problem is, yes, policy inconsistency, because in a sense, it's the way our political system is structured. It's structured in a way that allows us, in a sense, the group in power to make very widespread but also temporary decisions, because the next government can come and change it. And the thing is, Sri Lankan policies, any policy to be sustainable and to remain in the long term, has to have wide stakeholder support. So you know that in Sri Lanka, Sri Lankan policies often don't have that wide stakeholder support. They're often sustained and maintained by either the executive or very small group of elite policymakers. So that is an obvious challenge to these efforts. There has to be serious reform, but that is something the UNHRC draft resolution and these other resolutions are trying to address, is policy reform. So the US resolutions specifically cite things like the 20th Amendment. The UNHRC is talking about domestic political and judicial reform. The kind of values or the kind of policy reforms that are being kind of proposed or being championed are being done so with the hope that Sri Lankan policies become more consistent, because they would require the government to build a wider coalition And the thing is, once you have a wide coalition supporting any policy, it's harder to undo it. But when you have a small coalition, it's easier to undo that, which is what has been happening in Sri Lanka. Every government is able to basically override the previous government.
Now, Navam, speaking about policies and implementing these policies, at a local level, let's say policy inconsistency is at least within the boundaries of Sri Lanka. But even Sri Lanka's stance at the UNHRC has changed drastically, even though the same leader was heading the country at the time. For example, back in 2015, when the then Foreign Minister Mangala Samaraveera went to the UNHRC, they co-sponsored a resolution with similar conditions regarding Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka's human rights record, and agreed to cooperate with the international community in addressing these issues. However, and at the time, the current president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, was then Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, and not just any Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe. He was the first Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe under the 19th Amendment that granted much more powers to the Prime Minister. So Ranil Wickremesinghe was heading the cabinet at the time, and his Foreign Minister Mangala Samaraveera agreed to these conditions of the international community. President Ranil Wickremesinghe today, under the 20th Amendment, is the head of the cabinet. He is leading the country. His Foreign Minister, President's Counsel Ali Sabri, goes to the UNHRC and says, no, I'm sorry, we don't agree with these conditions. Do you think the international community is going to take us seriously?
So there are two things here. And the first is, as you correctly pointed out, the joint resolution when the current President Wickremesinghe was Prime Minister. There was tremendous amount of criticism for supporting that back in the United States and the United Kingdom and other countries. There was a feeling that these countries had, especially critics in the United States, this was an article published in Foreign Affairs, for instance, former advisors to the critics of that compromise, of that resolution, argued that by granting by passing that resolution, they were actually, in a sense, undermining the mission of the UNHRC. They did that because they wanted to express support for a new government. That was a new government. It was considered fragile by the international community. And so they thought international support would strengthen that government and also achieve the kind of objectives of the UNHRC. That didn't turn out to be the case, and it was heavily criticized back in those governments. So this time around, there is less appetite to provide an opening or an opportunity even for a Ranil Wickremesinghe-led government. That's on their side. On our side, the circumstances of President Ranil Wickremesinghe's leadership are also very different. The current president, as you know, does not have a popular mandate. He was voted out of his seat. He managed to come back into parliament and through the national list, and then was elected with the support of the ruling party, the majority party. So his circumstances are also very different, and therefore his relationship with the cabinet and his relationship with the political party in parliament that supports and sustains his policies are also fundamentally different. So there is less willingness from our international partners and other countries in the core group to give Sri Lanka an opportunity like we received in 2015. And the circumstances of President Wickremesinghe's current interactions with the UNHRC are also significantly different. So we have to take that into account in that answer. But yes, it is inconsistent in a sense, but this is because the political circumstances have, in a sense, fundamentally changed. It's President Wickremesinghe's his flexibility is limited, and of course the opportunities from the outside are also severely limited after the 2015 experience.
Navam, as an academic, although you hold this stance, there are those in the political sphere who would disagree with you. There are those who hailed the current president as one of the strongest leaders in the world. The chairman of the United National Party even went on to say that certain world leaders are scared of our president. But is this true? And is this the ground reality? We will discuss these matters and more after a short commercial break. Don't go anywhere. You're watching Newsline Live.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Newsfirst headlines. Main sponsor.
Anka ege ආරක්ෂිත ඉටිගිනි පෙට්ටිය. සූර්යා ගිනි පෙට්ටිය.
Where does the majority support?
Do you have the majority backing, though? That's
I
the
have the
question
majority backing.
of your country.
In the country, yes.
Where did Gotabaya Rajapaksa go wrong?
ඔය ටීවී ජයසුන්දර අජිත් නිවාල් කප්රාල් ආටිගල ඔය අය නිසා තමයි මනින්ම හිටපු ජනාධිපතිතුමාට මේ දූරෙන් සමුගන්න සිදු වුණේ.
Protest against suppression in Hyde Park. Who is Ali Sabri representing?
Ali Sabri අද ගිහිල්ලා එතන පෙනී හිටින්නේ ගෝඨාභය රාජපක්ෂ තමන්ගේ ක්ලයන්ට් ඔහුගේ කස්ටමර් ඔහු ගෝඨාභය රාජපක්ෂගේ ලෝයර් හැටියට තමයි අද පෙනී හිටින්නේ කියන එක මෙතන කියන්න ඕනේ.
The woes faced by onion farmers.
කජේට මේව පේන්නේ නැද්ද? මේව අපි කන්නේ මොනවද?
Newsfirst headlines. Main sponsor.
අංක ege ආරක්ෂිත ඉටිගිනි පෙට්ටිය. සූර්යා ගිනි පෙට්ටිය.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsline Live. We're in discussion with Navam Niles, a lecturer in international affairs, specializing in public international law. Navam, we were speaking about the predicament of the current president. Does he have a real mandate of the people? Does he not? Is he in a strong position of leadership? Is he not? We see many views on these matters, of course, being expressed in the political arena. But if my memory serves me right, I believe it's the Goebbels theory, where you repeat a lie a number of times, or a certain number of times, and it will turn out to be the truth, or at least people will believe so. So this statement, or the position that is held by certain politicians, that the current president of the country is in a very strong position, as far as international relations go, is also in a strong position when he sits among world leaders. He commands their respect, and in certain instances, their fear as well. Is this true? From an academic perspective, at least. Can this be supported by facts?
Right. So, I mean, it depends on how you measure strength and power. So, to measure strength and power, especially in today's world, I mean, Sri Lanka is not a grand military power. We don't have nuclear weapons. So, countries that are smaller than Sri Lanka that have a lot of power, say, for example, Singapore, or, you could even think of comparative countries like
Israel.
Again, yeah, Israel for that matter. Israel has nuclear weapons. Singapore is smaller, but far more influential because of its economy. It's a very large, interconnected, globalized economy with a lot of influence. Even if you don't have a large economy, you can have a lot of influence through what is known as soft power, the ability to attract others in other countries, by earning the trust of other countries, by having the influence in large institutions. This is how smaller European countries are able to punch much higher than their weights. You think of Netherlands and Denmark, they're smaller compared to their neighbors, but have a tremendous amount of influence because of their role in international law and international organizations. So smallness is not necessarily a sense of weakness. That much is true. You can be strong even if you don't have a large population or a large military or even nuclear weapons. You can be strong because of your economy, because of your, in a sense, your attractive qualities, the fact that you're able to use international organizations and institutions to compensate for the lack of your size. Sri Lanka, with this UNHRC resolution, has clearly lost a lot of goodwill, influence, and its ability to attract and gain the trust of other states has been severely undermined. So in a sense, Sri Lanka is a small country because of its small economy and its non-existent military. In a sense, its military capabilities cannot be a real source of strength. But its economy is small, and to make matters worse, our ability to compensate for that in international fora and through international law and institutions has been undermined as well. So there is no real basis for strength, particularly because all the avenues or the mechanisms for strength have been undermined or closed. So Sri Lanka is certainly in any reasonable measure not strong. It is in a very weak position. Sri Lanka's position has been criticized by in recent months and been kind of dubbed begging bowl diplomacy, right? Countries that really lack autonomy because of their predicament and the loss of the loss of international prestige or the loss of international goodwill is particularly damaging to smaller countries like Sri Lanka.
Navam, would an individual appointed as the head of state, especially given the sweeping powers that are afforded to the executive president of the country, depending on which person wields those powers, at least in the context of Sri Lanka, would that change drastically the position of Sri Lanka as far as strength, as you mentioned, is concerned in the international fora?
The thing is, the only basis for that, where a leader matters, is if the leader has some sort of charisma. So you can think of someone like Nelson Mandela or the Dalai Lama, or leaders like Gorbachev, right? People who had tremendous amount of personally very good relationships with their counterparts, especially counterparts that mattered. As far as I can tell, I don't see evidence of strong personal charisma or personal relationships between Ranil Wickremesinghe and his foreign counterparts. It might be there, we don't see it, but if we don't see it, that makes us wonder if it's really there. So that's one problem. The second problem is that individuals cannot substitute the state. If you're an American or an Indian or a Chinese diplomat and you're looking into Sri Lanka, you're wondering how long the current president can last, so how sincere his mandate is, how much of his policies could be completely reversed by a government that comes after him, or how shaky this coalition is. So really, individual charisma, we don't see much evidence of it. It might be there though, behind closed doors. But the lack of a mandate really might give countries serious reservations as opposed to the serious reservations in building more substantial relationships with the current government.
Thank you very much, Navam Niles, the lecturer in international relations, of course, specializing in public international law, for joining us on our show and commenting on these very complex matters. I believe much was spoken of. It was hopefully a productive conversation to all our viewers out there. But that's all the time we've got on Newsline. But we will meet you again, same time, same place, tomorrow. Until then, take care and God bless.